Can you tell me from a correction standpoint how juveniles coming into the adult system might present some different challenges than coming into a facility like Pendleton?
Well, it's a complicated issue to start with, just because of the fact that they are still juveniles, so they're still young in mind, in body, in spirit, and everything, and yet they have committed, in those cases, they have committed some pretty serious crimes against society, against other people. In some cases, some very heinous crimes. So you have the issue that you have to try to balance, what is in the best interest of the youth and what's in the best interest of society, and then what's in the best interest of the facilities that have to house these particular offenders. So in those cases, you have to somehow weigh the child's developmental level, I guess, and where they're at as far as physical appearance, mental capacity, and those types of things, and then what risks they pose to the facilities and the other students or offenders that they'll be housed with. So those cases where they pose some very significant safety and security risks, obviously is the first and foremost concern. So you look at those issues and you have to determine, what is the best facility, what is the most appropriate facility to place these types of offenders in. And up until recently, the state of Indiana Department of Corrections has always placed, if a youth was sentenced as an adult, we have always placed them at the Youthful Offender Program at the adult facility in Wabash. Recently, we had a case which kind of went outside the ordinary boundaries of what you would think of when you think of a youth who has been waived to adult and sentenced as an adult offender. And that was a 12-year-old youth who had committed a murder, had been involved in committing a murder. And when you look at it, waived to adult, so sentenced as an adult, but it was such an outlier when you looked at the other types of kids who were waived and sentenced to adults, to take a 12-year-old child essentially and place them in a youthful offender program inside of an adult facility seemed very extreme even under these conditions. So the department went outside the box a little bit and decided that, it's in the best interest of this particular offender to go ahead and attempt to hold him in a juvenile facility until, at least for a couple of years, to give him give him the potential to at least grow some, mature some, and be in a position to where he can actually be in a position to be able to adapt to the adult population, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
We're obviously talking about Paul Gingrich, and his physical stature is actually small. Does it present any challenges to bring a boy such as him with a murder conviction on his record into the population? Does the word murder even change the dynamic at all of when kids come into any facility?
It does. I think, obviously, the other students or offenders and the staff obviously take notice of that type of offense, and I think they probably have a tendency to treat that person a little bit differently, at least at first, be a little more cautious of that particular student. It's a little more unique I think what's more unique in this situation is having a 12-year-old in a juvenile facility who is technically sentenced as an adult offender. That, I think, is what's proving to pose the most significant challenges for the staff and the other students that he's interacting with on a daily basis.
Do you know how he's doing at all? Does he seem to be adapting well? Is there any feedback on it?
The reports I get, I think that the staff are working very, very challenging with it. They're working very hard to try to do the right things. They care about his case. They care about him tremendously. So they're doing everything that they can to keep him focused, keep him on the right track, because what he does here now, as far as programs and education, is going to benefit him in the long run when he does make that transition, because the programs that he's involved in will ultimately impact his release dates with his adult sentence. So it's important to keep him focused and keep him on track. At the same time, it's challenging because knowing that he's technically an adult offender, at least an adult sentenced offender, he's still 12, maybe 13 now. So he still has a lot of youthful behaviors that are challenging as well, so just like we do with any of the other kids that we have in this facility. So from that aspect, he fits right in well with them. He's very well adjusted. He seems to be a very smart kid, and I think in most cases he tries to stay focused. He tries to do the right thing, but he's an adolescent, and as we all know, they don't always stay focused, and they do sometimes make the wrong decisions.
Do you remember what your reaction was the day you heard that this 12-year-old had been sentenced as an adult and the judge actually wanted him to be in the Wabash unit? Do you remember, like, what's your first reaction when you're executive director to something like that?
Well, my first reaction was, how do we manage this situation? On one hand, I was shocked and confused, and on the other hand, I completely understood the reasoning behind it. It was a serious crime. There's a family out there and victims who have been impacted by what Paul did, and it was dreadful. Words can't explain, obviously, the impact that his crime has had on the victims and the people in the community that he hurt. So from that aspect of it, I can certainly understand the reasoning behind the waiver to adult and the judge's position on that. And at the same time, so you have those serious issues on one hand, and on the other hand, you still have to wrestle with the fact that he's still a 12-year-old kid. And to take a 12-year-old child and say, you've got a 25-year sentence as an adult, and you are now going to be placed in an adult prison, that's difficult. Now, personally, I don't believe that gives him a proper opportunity or a chance to grow and develop normally. And I think that we have to do the best we can to manage those difficult cases in the best way that we can in order to at least give them an opportunity, give them a chance to succeed. And while we do a pretty good job, we do a darn good job, in fact, with the Youthful Offender Program at Wabash. The fact is you can't put a 12-year-old child in that type of environment and expect them to have half a chance. You just can't do it.
Earlier we were talking about the fear factor of kids when they are actually finally sentenced to an adult prison. So many of the kids that we talked to, first of all, said, I was shocked when I was waived. They assumed because they were juveniles that they would never ultimately be waived. And then when they found out that they were actually going to be serving time in an adult prison, even though it's a youth offender unit, they just can't believe their fate. Then this bravado starts to take place and they kind of gear themselves up for that. But you've spent your professional life in adult prisons. Can you talk to us a little bit about the fear factor involved in walking into a prison like that for the first time, especially if you're a kid?
Yeah, when we were talking earlier, I gave you the example when I was 21 years old walking in to be a correctional officer for the first time at the Missouri State Penitentiary. I was petrified, and I was just going in there to work. So obviously, the natural reaction, human nature is, particularly for a kid who's going into an environment like that, a brutal environment in some cases, they just simply have to be scared to death. And I think at some point, your survival mechanisms kick in, and they learn to adapt and to do the best they can, and they learn survival skills. What it takes to survive in an environment like that, and it's not a positive learning environment either. So it's got to be without question, it's got to be the most scariest thing that they've ever gone through.
What are the survival skills? What do people have to come to grips with when they're going to be serving, a pretty lengthy sentence behind bars?
Well, I think first and foremost they have to come to grips with, the inmate code, so to speak. There are certain things that we as correctional facility administrators and staff require and expect from the population, but at the same time there's also a code that the population expects of the other inmates and offenders. That even if that crosses the boundary lines, or crosses the rules against what the staff expectations are, if it's a code that the offender population thinks you need to abide by, for your own safety, you pretty much have to you have to go with the code for the offender code. And so, and that sometimes presents its own challenges, because then, you break the rules or you've done certain things against the administration, and then you have a price to pay for that as well. But obviously, you could pay a more severe price if you break the offender code.
I remember when one of the kids we were following was transitioning out of the youth unit into general population at Wabash, one of the correctional officers, as he was leaving, said, "Just remember, the word you need to remember most is no, no." And the kid wasn't exactly sure what she meant, but the further we got into our walk over to his unit, it started to dawn on him that I really probably shouldn't trust anyone. If somebody offers me something now that I'm in the adult population, I should say no. And he was asking questions about whether or not, is that what she meant? And I wonder how the adult offenders feel when they see a kid walking into their unit. Do you have any idea? Have you ever kind of watched that transition?
I have, and it has its own unique dynamic to it, obviously. Because I think that there are probably some adult offenders who sincerely want to try to do the right thing and help with that transition. Yet there's a lot of predators out there as well who will eat the weakness up. If you have a 18-year-old or 19-year-old now walking into that type of environment for the first time, transitioning, particularly ones that are known to be transitioning out of the youthful offender program, and they're well known. I mean, the adult population knows who they are, and they know when they get there. Obviously, that makes that youth very susceptible to some of the games and the different things that the population tries to pull on them in order to get them to do certain things. And they can clearly, if you react to those situations in the wrong way, if you don't use no, they can get into trouble very quickly. Serious trouble. I mean, life endangering type of trouble.
And the kids have in their own mind, they've conjured up all sorts of scenarios about what it's really like living side by side with adult offenders. But ultimately, is there anything that can prepare anybody for life inside prison?
I don't think so. I think really it's, you have to be there and you have to adapt to the environment that you're in. And I think you learn the skills that it takes, those survival skills, just by being there. I think that it's important that we have programs in place that do the best that we can to help prepare those youth for that transition. And in some cases, I think we do a pretty good job on that. And I think in others, we're learning just as much as the others, as much as the students and offenders are. In some cases, there are things that we need to do better. And we're dedicated to that process. And the more we can help them adapt and help them with that transition, the more successful they'll be on the other side.
What would you want, people in the legal community and also judges to know, anything in particular as they're weighing their decisions on the bench on should we waive or shouldn't we waive, and should we commit to an adult prison or should we look for, alternative programs? When it comes to kids in the system, is there anything in particular you'd want the public or the legal community to know?
Well, obviously it's difficult, complex, incredibly complex issue, and there is no easy answer. And I think the important thing is that you have to remain focused on, there is a child involved, regardless of the offense that they may have committed. I mean, you still have to weigh the fact that, this is still a 12, 13, 14-year-old child, and they are not fully developed. And I think that has to be taken into consideration and weighed. You also have to weigh, I completely agree. You have to weigh that against, the nature of the crime that was committed, and it becomes very difficult. But I think in the end, as a society, we have to have a system in place that allows for a dual jurisdiction types of sentences, so that in those extreme cases, even though the child's been waived to adult, sentenced as an adult, the judge can still have some authority to invoke a juvenile sentence, or the Department of Corrections, in our case at least, has the option to still place that youth, that offender, in a juvenile facility until they can at least reach a level of maturity that gives them the ability to at least have a chance of survival in that type of extreme atmosphere in an adult prison.
Final question. After all the years of doing this kind of work, do you believe in redemption and hope for these kids, and have you seen it?
I absolutely do.
You'd have to say like, I believe in redemption and hope.
I believe in redemption and hope. Honestly, I do believe in redemption and hope. The sad fact is that a lot of these kids, they see no hope in themselves. So the challenge for the staff is to find a way to reach that child in a way that they can invoke that hope. So that, because without the hope, you're not going to get the redemption piece either. So just by a child or a student realizing that they don't have to be destined to this type of lifestyle or be destined to adult prison, which is what a lot of them think. They think, I have relatives that are across the street in the adult prison, and that's where I'm destined to go. That's my fate. They truly believe that. When you talk to them, you see it in their eyes. They literally, truly believe that is their fate, is to go across the street to an adult prison. So somehow you have to get through and break that down and make them realize that there is hope. And once they start to see the hope, that they have that hope, then you see everything start to change. Everything starts to change. Their attitudes, how they go about their days, the way that they treat and respect one another, and the way they treat and respect the staff. They start to focus on their education and vocational programs, and they start to do the right things that it takes to turn their life around. But they don't have that until they recognize that they do have some hope.
I lied, I said last question, but I just have one more. Some of the kids that we're following, and they're actually, believe it or not, it's the murder cases. It was first offense. Hadn't even been in the juvenile justice system before, which is a whole nother issue. But I just lost my train of thought. Hold on one second. Oh, one of the kids that we're following, there's some very strong belief that there's a mental health issue with this particular boy who is involved in a murder case. How do we handle the kids where you're not looking at a child who ever had any brush with the law and doesn't have that sort of criminal background, but has committed a heinous offense, and there's an issue of mental health involved? How do you even resolve that, the mental health issue?
That's another complex issue. I'd start by saying that the correctional system is not the place to deal with kids who have severe mental health issues. I have seen it time and time again. The system makes those cases worse, no matter how hard we try, no matter how many wonderful staff and programs we have in place to try to meet the needs of those the mental health needs of those challenging situations. It's the environment, it's the other kids and students, offenders that they're around that has a negative impact, and it deteriorates even worse the mental health condition of those types of kids. Corrections facilities are just not the place. They're not. And we have to find a resolution to that. We get those types of kids in our facilities on a regular basis, and quite frankly, those situations, those cases drive me nuts. They make me beat my head against the wall because this is not the place for them. They don't belong here. In some cases, we can go through the court process. In the most severe cases, we can go through and have those cases committed to mental health facilities so that they're essentially released from their Department of Corrections offense and then committed to a mental health facility. But again, that's something that should be done on the front end, not something that the Department of Corrections should be responsible for doing. Everybody knows who those cases are when they're in the courtroom. Everybody knows who those cases are before they hit that courtroom. There has to be services and programs in place that meet the needs of those types of kids before they even commit that type of act that gets them into the courtroom to begin with. That's where I think we're dropping the ball. We don't have things in place to recognize that and to give those services to the kids that they need before they reach that level.
And they're the most expensive kids.
They are, without a doubt. They are, providing services to those types of kids is very expensive. And whether we want to admit it or not, funding for those types of services is the bottom line. It's the key point. It's the one thing that is preventing them from getting those services. It's all about the funding. And who's going to pay for it? Where's the funding going to come from? It's the issue, without a question.
Good. Little room tone, we're done.
Was there anything I missed?
Yeah.
Let me think.
Anything else?
Let's just say, let's say this.
Give me a sec. I'll get this just right.
Just weave this in wherever
Yeah,
it
well,
works.
absolutely. We always use it. And we've got 2 shows to fill, so.
Great.
You'll be in 2 shows.
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Okay.
All right. The other thing that I would add is that even though this is a complicated issue when you look at all the different aspects and things that have to be considered, I think that it's important that we just boil it down to its most simplest aspects of a case, and that is that you have a child and he or she needs to be provided services that can best address those issues as a child. So in the end, I guess what I would say is that juvenile services are most appropriate for kids, without question, regardless of the crime that they committed. Until they are mature and developed enough to where they can transition into an adult facility, those kids need to be in the juvenile system. If they have to be locked, if they have to be in a secure facility, they need to be in a juvenile facility. And then as they grow, as they mature, or as they prove to be so aggressive that they can't receive services in the juvenile facility, then they should be transferred to an adult facility. I think that would be the right way to do it. It gives the kids a chance and an opportunity to develop and grow until they reach a more appropriate age to be transitioned into the adult population.
And you actually offer more services, really, in the juvenile system.
We do.
Education-wise.
True. I mean, we do a good job on the youthful offender program as far as programs that they offer. But the fact is, it's an adult facility. So, the staff look at things from an adult facility perspective. And that's just not appropriate for these types of youthful offenders. They need services. They need to be treated like they're kids, because they still are. They may be serious, dangerous kids, but they can best be provided services, the most effective services in the juvenile system. I made a stance.
The only thing I would think would be to say that, because that's an important message, and say it almost anecdotally about, like, Paul, insofar as he has 5 years of services to look forward to in the juvenile system. What you just described, what does that look like for Paul? Like, take it into a more, as compared to, say, one of the kids at Wabash who's about to transition out, or gets there at 17, has 1 year there. I mean, developmentally, the first 5 years of incarceration for Paul are
So
gonna
in other
look a lot
words,
different.
address it as almost where, especially when you're looking at a 12-year-old, you're looking at a kid
Yeah,
who's.
that's because
Does that mean-
everyone, when I'm on the outside and I talk about the fact that we're touching base with 12 and 13-year-old kids, they think immediately, well, just because you've incarcerated them with an adult sentence, at that point you've thrown them away. And I say, well, no, actually, in the juvenile system, they probably get better education than they've ever gotten, things like that. So I'm just thinking almost more in terms of this actual case. What those things you said, that juveniles need juvenile services. Let's just go through that again, but with some specifics to a case like Paul's. Does that make sense?
Did you get all that?
No? All right.
I think so. You know, one of the things that's different, though, is that, you know, there's a huge difference between a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old. Huge difference. Huge developmental difference. So whereas you might be able to take a 15-year-old who's been waived and sentenced as an adult, again, I think you got to look at the cases individually and look at the maturity level of the offender individually and then make a determination, you know, what is the most appropriate services for this particular youth? Is it juvenile or is it adult? What will work in the best interest? What will serve the best interest of that youth? And in some cases, I think, you know, when you look at the offense and you look at the types of services that are needed, and the bottom line fact is that this kid is going to go into the adult population at some point. You may need, in some cases, the situation may be that, you know, they need to be a part of that environment from the very beginning so that they can begin that transition. Particularly like a 16 or 17-year-old who you know is going to transition to the adult population within a few months, or, you know, 12 to 18 months. They need an opportunity to have a transitional period so that they're just not thrust into that environment. I think that's extremely important. On the other hand, you know, when you have the 12 and the 13 to 14-year-olds, they won't need to be exposed to that environment for several years until they're ready, a bit older, and ready to make that transition. And then I think it's our obligation then to have services in place that will help foster that transition in the most positive direction that it can go, and to give that youth the right opportunity to be successful once they reach that level.
And when you look at a kid like Paul, who's 12, that's a whole lot of services for a whole lot of time. I mean, that's such a young kid to come into a system like this.
Yeah, and you know, the truth of the matter is, you have this 12-year-old Paul, and then by the time he's 18, he's going to be a completely different person. Completely different person.
His entire adolescence, his entire puberty is spent inside of a correctional facility.
Yeah, I mean, that's challenging for him, and it's very challenging for the staff as well. Most of the kids that we get in our juvenile system are going to be here for 6 to 12 months tops. A few a little bit longer than that, some shorter than that. But they know that they're not going to spend their entire juvenile, their adolescence in a facility like this. So I think that takes on a different dynamic when you have somebody like Paul, who is 12 years old, who already knows or recognizes the fact that, you know, he's gonna essentially have to grow up, go through puberty and adolescence in a correctional facility, whether it's a juvenile or an adult facility. And again, I have to say that in those particular cases, the juvenile facility is the one most prepared, best prepared to help him through that type of growth.
Do you know, there will be people that watch this that it's still hard for me to wrap my head around a 12-year-old getting a 30-year sentence. Is there the opportunity for sentence modification for some of these cases? Have you witnessed that happen a lot?
There hasn't been that I've seen. I think there should be, particularly for these younger kids who are already waived and sentenced as an adult offender. You know, in Paul's case, I can definitely see where it would be beneficial, you know, by the time he's 18, that maybe there should be a new court hearing that would take a look at the fact that now, you know, he's 5 or 6 years older, he's more developed, he's grown up, and then see where he's at and whether or not they could suspend the remainder of his sentence and place him back out on parole, or maybe invoke some other type of sentence that would be more appropriate. I think that's something that as a society, as a justice agency, that the country needs to take a very close look at, because he's not the same kid he was when he was 12-year-old at that age.
The whole issue of crime and punishment is it's always a hot button issue. There are always going to be those people who say, you do the crime, don't do
Right.
the crime if you can't do the time. Yet it seems to take on a different meaning when you're talking about kids this young.
It does to me, and I think it obviously does to you as well. And I think to the vast majority of the population out there, it does take on a different context. And I think that, the general public really doesn't know much about juvenile justice or the adult justice systems. And so I think that, when most people hear that a 12-year-old has been sentenced as an adult for killing somebody,
Which was his
first offense, I would venture to guess that most people, even though they hear that, they don't recognize the fact that a 12-year-old is now expected to spend the next 25 years in an adult prison, and they don't stop and think about the seriousness of that, and whether or not what type of life or opportunity does that present to that child to grow up in that type of environment. You're essentially washing your hands of that particular person, and you're saying, as a society, we've given up on you. And, that's, I think, what we have to turn around. You can't give up on a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old, because eventually they're going to grow up. And in 98% of the cases, they're going to grow out of the types of behaviors that they've been involved with. And I don't want that to sound like I negate the type of offense that they committed, because I don't mean that at all.
But eventually they're all going to get out anyway.
Yes,
They
absolutely,
will be out.
Absolutely.
It's not like they're going to be locked up for the rest of their life. So the question is, how much punishment is enough punishment for the crime?
Yeah, and in Paul's case, he received a 25-year sentence. I think 5 of it was suspended, so essentially a 20-year sentence, which with the right types of programs and behaviors, I think you could calculate out that, in about 12 years, he would be eligible for release.
So from 12 to 24.
Right. So he would still have an awful lot of his life ahead of him still. And I think that he will be better prepared for that opportunity by remaining in a juvenile facility as opposed to he would be if he was clearly spending all that time in an adult facility.
We were talking to an adult offender who is now 32, who was sentenced at 14. He's been in prison ever since for killing his parents. And he was saying back then there was no youth offender unit. He was 14. He was shipped to Wabash, and he was in with the entire adult offender population.
And so I imagine he had to grow up pretty quick.
Yes, he grew up very quick. So we have made some strides, but I still do think that juvenile justice is the great unknown frontier. When the headlines fade, nobody knows what happens to these kids once the court cases are over.
And nobody knows what is the right way to do it. I mean, everybody who's involved in juvenile and the adult systems struggles with that aspect of it. What is the right way to do it? And the best I can tell you is, again, I think you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis and try to figure out individually what is the best thing to do for this particular youth. And I think that's important. But I think that also, when you talk about the adult that you had interviewed, that made me think about also, another aspect of things that we have to consider is it's important to look at the history of that particular child. Many of the kids that we have involved in our systems have gone through extreme traumatic situations. They have severe cases and histories which in the end, they end up, what am I say. They end up perpetuating the situation and resulting in the behaviors that you see. So I think it's important whether you place them in a juvenile system or an adult system, you have to have systems in place that address those traumas that they've suffered, because you're not gonna fix the behaviors without addressing the traumas that they've been through.
Good point. That's a really good point. And that actually goes well to Benny and Blade. The other two boys we're following who, I don't know if you remember, there was this murder case in Brown County. They murdered an old man, an 87-year-old man, almost killed his wife. First offense, went there to steal beer. And they got, they were brothers. The little one was 13, and they think there's autism. Something's definitely not right. When you see him on TV, you'll know it. Man, I should have taken my ginkgo today because I am just losing my train of thought. Oh, it comes to the whole mental health issue, and as it turns out, they were Chin's kids. We didn't find this out until like a half hour into my interview with him. The kid blurts out that his biological parents' rights were terminated. They were drug addicts. They were, abusive. They lived in these horrible conditions. They were then adopted by a foster family that they ended up living with. But I was like,
Yeah, one of the things that we're starting to look at on the juvenile side, and this is, I think all the states are starting to look at that, is looking at providing juvenile services in what we call trauma-informed care, so that staff are trained and prepared to work with these youth and recognize that, where that behavior is really coming from. And that they recognize that what you see is coming from something completely different. It's coming from a trauma or a situation that occurred years ago, and that we have to find a way to address that. We have to resolve the issues of that trauma before we can take the child to the next level.